Have you and your family ever thought that your little brother or sister was just a little demon that only ever wants to be fed? Me neither. But if you have, you may very well understand the origins of this story. It was midday at the height of summer when Katty McLaughlin stepped onto the bog at Mean Doran with her son tied to her back, and in her hand a basket with some stirabout for her husband's lunch. All too soon the summer would be over, and she stood a moment watching the men slicing into the peat and laying it in rows, and then she untied her son and placed him onto the long grass. Her husband Brian came over and sat down to eat, and when they turned around, their son was gone. How quickly the workers in the bog grew frantic, and then Mickey Doherty began to run when he saw the child crawling towards a dark bog pool. The child fell into the water, but for a moment, before the big hand of Mickey Doherty fished him out, and everybody was relieved. The child was wet, but unharmed, and Katty McLaughlin fell onto her knees in thanks. It was only when she brought him home that Katty felt something was wrong. She stared into the child's face and saw cold, glassy eyes staring back, eyes that seemed to belong to somebody else, somebody much other. She thought, as though something else was inhabiting her child. She went about her housework, for she had so much to do, but she could not escape the feeling that something was wrong. That night, the child did not sleep, and in the morning, he spoke his first words. Not mama or dada, but feed me, in a strange, deep voice. It sounded to Katty like the voice of an older man, and she stared into the cold, glassy eyes and grew afraid, and did what she was told. For the next week, the child spoke nothing else but the same two words in the strange, deep voice. Feed me, he said after breakfast. Feed me, he said after lunch. Feed me, he said after dinner. Feed me, he said in the middle of the night, and poor Katty had to get up and do what she was told. Soon the child was eating the food that was meant for her husband, who had to do a long day's work. Soon there was no food in the house. That child is going to eat us out of house and home, Brian said. It was as though a curse had come upon them. The child with the cold, glassy eyes who stared at his mother as though he did not know her, while Kathy stared back and saw the eyes of an old man, the mouth eating as much food each day as two full-grown men. The neighbours grew worried and a council was held. A wise old woman took a look at the child and said that the child was not Katty's child, that her child had been taken when he fell into the bog pool and was replaced by another, a changeling, sent back by an evil bog spirit looking to be well fed in his old age. The council was told that to get the child back, they would have to entice the changeling to jump back into the pool. One by one, the people of the townland walked silently onto the bog at Mean Doran, where the turf lay stacked and waiting to dry before winter. An orange glow filled the sky when they came upon the bog pool. They stood around it while Katty held the changeling in her arms, then placed him down on the grass. She looked into the eyes of the child and was sure she saw the eyes of an old man. It was then the people began to throw their food into the bog pool, pieces of bread and cake and whatever else they had lying about. And somebody said he saw a small flash of light shooting towards the pool. And another said it was as though a hare had bolted. Because when Katty looked down again at the child, she saw the smiling eyes of her little boy, who let out a cry of happiness when he saw his mother. The changeling had leapt back into the pool when he saw the food. And from that day on, there was peace in the house of the McLaughlins.
Now, let me tell you. It was the first week of November and the road was silent but for a carriage that went by like a grim spectre. And then it was gone, leaving nothing to be heard but the click of my footsteps. I was on my way to Biddy Early's, where I was lodging for the winter, and I was thinking of the nice cutlet awaiting me and a cup of tea, and perhaps before bed a wee sup of the woman's porter. The road took me to Ball's Bridge over the Dodder, and as I was stepping towards it, I saw a strange thing that brought a stop to my feet. A mist was steaming up from the water, and yet there was no mist anywhere else that night, though it was cold enough. I thought to myself, why not take a look and see what that strange mist is about? I was stepping down off the road when a jet of cold air passed through my chest and took my breath, and I had to wrap my arms to keep warm. It was dark down by the abutment of the bridge, and as I peered at the strange mist, I thought I saw a figure of a woman sitting on her hunkers. She had a great cloak wrapped around her, and her head was bowed, and it was only as I drew close that I heard her crying, a great keening sound as though she was overcome by grief. My heart went out to the poor woman, down on her luck and sleeping like this under a bridge. So I stepped towards her to give her a coin. But when I drew close, let me tell you, I saw she was no more an old woman than she was an old cat. I did not know what she was, to be honest. She had hair that grew down from her head to the ground around her like flowing water, an extravagant growth of silver hair that looked like the hair of both a young and old woman at the same time. It was at this moment I sensed what was before me, and I wanted to turn and run. But I just stood there like a fool. And it was then the old woman turned her face toward me. Ah, what a face. It was not a face, but something so hard I cannot describe it to you. Her eyes were not like eyes at all, but two dark holes that if you looked into them, you might be swallowed into a darkness from which you might not get out again. That's what I thought, seeing into those eyes. And the flesh on the face did not look like flesh. Or if it did, it was the flesh of a dead body. And the creature looked both alive and dead at once. That was the moment when I should have turned on my heels and ran. But the strangest thing came over me. In my horror, all I could do was look. And it was then the creature rose up from her hunkers and gazed at me with those two black eyes that were not eyes, and all that hair flowing down like water. Before I knew it, I was scrambling up the bank and met the road at a run and did not stop until I got to my lodgings, where Biddy Early let me in after a great banging on her door. After this, I do not know what happened, but I was told that I ran into the kitchen and collapsed in a faint on the floor, only to be awoken by Biddy pouring porter down my throat. "What in the name of God is wrong with you?" she said. And I could not speak until I sat up and had another drink, and then I told her what I saw. "Ah," said she, "you have come face to face with the Banshee." And she told me that I must be on my guard and to expect bad news, because the Banshee only calls on those who are soon to lose a loved one. A day later, the letter arrived on the Galway coach from my brother. My dear father had passed away the previous night, and that same night the Banshee was heard outside the house. My father had passed away from old age, though truth be told, I often wonder if it wasn't old age that killed him, but something else. Perhaps he too heard the Banshee and looked out the window that night, and he might have seen the two black eyes of the Banshee that were not eyes. Two black eyes that might have swallowed the soul of the dear man and taken him to his death.
Long ago, in the dark ages of Ireland, a monk was travelling alone through the country. He watched the cold winter sky and knew that soon it would be dark. But there was not a house nor an inn along the road where he could borrow a bed for the night. As the sun went down, an inky blackness filled the sky, and the monk grew afraid because he knew this part of the land was preyed on by wolves. He stepped off the road into a forest where he could light a fire without being seen. He found a small clearing and snacked on some bread and water, and then he put his head on some moss and he went to sleep. But he awoke after what seemed like an instant, for across the treetops he heard the chilling howl of a wolf. The fire had burned down to a red glow, and the monk thought he could hear something moving towards him. He wanted to run, but he could not run, and remaining very still, held his breath. It was then he heard a voice in the darkness, a rough voice that sounded like a man speaking through the mouth of an animal. And he watched with dread as the figure of a wolf came towards him. By the glow of the fire, he saw the yellow fangs and dark fur. Though the wolf seemed to him no ordinary wolf, and the monk knew he was face to face with a Wolfman. "Please," he begged, "do not kill me. I am nothing but a poor monk travelling the road." The Wolfman made a strange noise, as though to clear his throat. Then he began to speak in a strange, sad voice. "Do not be afraid," he said. "I have come because I am tired, and I want to talk with you after living such a long time as a wolf." As he said this, the Wolfman drew a little closer and leaned towards the monk and sniffed. "I want to tell you my story," the Wolfman said. "I am tired of the life I must lead as a wolf, though there is no end to my tale as yet. I was once a young man, a fierce warrior and outlaw who took coin from local chiefs to raise hell on the lands of their enemies. At night, I would shapeshift into a wolf and raid their cattle, and sometimes I would attack the chieftains too, taking vengeance for the wrongs they had committed." The monk watched the eyes of the Wolfman, the yellow eyes, that seemed for a moment almost human, as though there was indeed a young man watching through the slanted eyes. The Wolfman moved a little closer again and took another sniff of the monk. "Oh, it was an exciting life, let me tell you. To be able to do as I pleased, to go out and wreak havoc across the lands. But a terrible thing happened to me. There was a rule, a most important rule that had to be obeyed, and it was this. When a shapeshifter lies down to become a wolf, no one must disturb or move his body, for his spirit will not be able to return. It was at this time that an enemy of mine came to my house, telling my wife that I owed him some money. My wife looked into his eyes, knew that he was lying, that he was sent instead by an enemy chieftain to do me harm. The man demanded a search of my house, and my wife could not stop him. The monk watched the Wolfman draw closer, so close now, he could catch the strange musk of the supernatural creature, the smell of blood and forest musk, and something else he could not identify. The Wolfman leaned in again, even closer, and took another sniff. as though smelling a nice piece of meat. It was my bad fortune that the man found my body. Despite the best efforts of my wife, he tried to wake me. And when he could not wake me, he decided to take my body away with him. From that moment on, I could not shapeshift back into the body, and I became trapped in this life as a wolf. Now I have grown so tired of this life, the Wolfman said. I would like nothing better than to return to my body and lead a quiet life. That is not possible now. The taste of blood does nothing for me anymore. My wife is long dead. Dead 1,000 years. Still I must go on. Drawn on each night against my will by the smell of blood, causing devastation in the fields. The monk stared in horror at the Wolfman as he yawned. He looked as though he was going to eat him. He saw the yellow teeth and closed his eyes. And they remained like so a long moment, thinking he had met his end. But when he opened his eyes, he saw that the shapeshifter was gone. The strange, sad Wolfman had returned to the forest. And the night all around them was still.
This story is set on the eve of Samhain, the one night of the year where the veil between our world and the ooky spooky spirit world is thinnest. That means that all the ghosties and ghoulies and ghastlies can slip through a rip in the space-time continuum and come over to our side and frighten the living daylights out of us. Many people think that this is a thing of the past, that the ghosts and the monsters were only makey-uppy old stories, and that nowadays the scariest thing you could face is running out of ice cream on a hot day. But I'm going to let you in on a secret. The ghosts and monsters of ancient Samhain are very real indeed. This is the tale of Puka, a mischievous shapeshifter from the spirit world who got stuck on Earth one Halloween night not so long ago. Puka was a friendly but cheeky little shape-shifting ghost who lived with his ghost mammy and his ghost daddy in a little ghost estate deep in the spirit realm. He was like any other young spirit. He liked playing ghastly games with his pals in the playground. He liked slurping spooky spaghetti at dinner time. He went to spooky school to learn the fundamentals of scaring. Samhain had been the only topic of discussion at school for months now. The head teacher at the scare school was Miss Morrigan, a strict and fearsome creature of a teacher who didn't tolerate any messing. "Class," she would crow, "you have been trained in the art of scaring by the best in the business. It is your duty to be on your worst behaviour this Samhain and to represent the school by absolutely petrifying the humans on the other side." Samhain was always planned with military precision. Every spooky citizen of the spirit realm would be assigned a human that they were to terrorise for the night. They would receive a special folder from the Department of Nightmares and Phobias with all the details. When Puka got home from school that day, his parents were sat at the kitchen table, barely able to contain their excitement. "It's arrived, Puka! Your first ever dossier of doom!" they both chirped together. Meanwhile, on Earth, a young girl named Fia was shopping for Halloween costumes with her dad and Pop. "I need to up my game," she said with fierce determination. "Last year, I was pipped to the post by Pippa Prunty in her princess costume. I won't be losing out at the All Hallows School Spookathon this year, you mark my words." Fia's fathers exchanged concerned glances. "Now, Fia, remember last year you nearly gave your teacher a heart attack because of how gory your goblin costume was?" said Pop gently. Fia rolled her eyes. "It's not my fault she wasn't expecting the eyes to pop out or the built-in blood-spurting features," Some people are just amateurs when it comes to Halloween. Dad held up a selection of costumes with a hopeful smile. How about you go as a pumpkin this year? Oh, or look at this adorable cat costume, sweetie. You would make the cutest little cat. But it was no use. Fia wasn't one for cutesy costumes at Halloween. She wanted to be totally terrifying, heart-stoppingly horrifying, and there was no way Dad or Pop could convince her otherwise. They both grimaced as they went up to the till with the makings of a grotesque zombie ensemble that their tenacious daughter had assembled. You see, Fia was completely fearless. Ever since she was little, nothing could ever frighten her. Her parents hadn't a clue where she got those genes from. They were both scaredy cats of the highest order. If ever there was a big hairy spider lurking in the corner of the bathroom, both her dad and her pop would run squealing from the house as Fia calmly cupped the 8-legged beast in her hand and set him free out the window. Or, on the rare occasion that something went bump in the night, it was Fia, not the grown-ups, who would go and investigate. She truly was the bravest person on the planet, and nothing ever fazed her. At last, the big day came, and both Puka and Fia leapt out of their beds. "It's today!" they both yelped, albeit on opposite sides of the universe. They both rushed about all morning, making sure that they looked as grisly and as gruesome as possible, so that they had the best chance of success. Both sets of parents were bursting with pride as they watched their little ones walk down the garden path. Fia hurried across the green to her school, and Puka made his way down to Newgrange, where he met his friends looking as spooky as could be. At Newgrange, Miss Morrigan was waiting for her students. "Remember, class, you have until midnight, not a minute more and not a minute less. If you do not return to the portal by this time tomorrow, you will be stuck in the human world forever." With that, the sky changed colour, and a strange sort of electricity hung in the air. There was crashing and buzzing and banging, and suddenly a great swirling black hole appeared out of nowhere. "Best of luck, Afashti! See you on the other side!" crowed Miss Morrigan as everyone took a deep breath and jumped into the portal. Puka was spat out onto a patch of grass near a housing estate, bustling with parents and their kids trick-or-treating. Time to get to work, he thought. Puka double-checked the address and took off through the air, flying over the houses until he landed outside Fia's place. Once there, he used his magic to pick the lock and moved through the house looking for a suitable place to hide. He surveyed Fia's room. Under the bed? In the wardrobe? Nah, too cliché. He spotted a toy box in the corner of the room. Ideal, he said to himself. I'll wait till she decides to pull out some silly dolls or teddy bears, and when she least expects it, I'll leap out and screech boo at the top of my lungs, he thought with a smug smile spreading across his face. He climbed inside and waited quietly for Fia to get home so he could terrify her. Fia and her dads had done the rounds of all the houses, and her bag was bursting with delicious sweets. As they made their way down the street towards their house, Fia's pop was excited to get inside and away from all the scary costumes, and her dad nearly jumped out of his skin every time a firework went off. But Fia was unfazed as ever. Another boring Halloween without a proper scare, she thought out loud. When they got home, Fia went up to her room and tore into her bag of sweets and ate until she had a bellyache. Soon it was time for bed, so she went to her toy chest to retrieve her favourite stuffed spider that she liked to sleep with. But as she crossed the room, suddenly the lights went out. Not just her bedside lamp, but it seemed that all the street lamps had gone dark too. Nice try, Dads, Fia thought. But then the room went icy cold and a thick mist began floating around her feet. Wow! They've really gone all out, she said to herself as she tried to make out where the dry ice was coming from. Just then, the toy chest began to rattle violently. Fia beamed with excitement, waiting to see what her dads had cooked up as a spooky surprise. A bright green light flooded the room and almost blinded her as an almighty shriek pierced her ears. Puka emerged from the toy box and hovered ominously over Fia, grimacing and grumbling. He expected her to scream a blood-curdling scream and run in search of safety. But not our fearless Fia, oh no. She stared in wonder, clapping her hands with delight. Whoa, Pop, what an amazing Puka costume. It's so authentic, she marvelled as Puka drooled green slime all over the floor. Puka was stumped. This wasn't part of the training. He thought on his feet and upped his game. He picked Fia up and flew around the room, darting from one side to the other, hoping to frighten Fia out of her wits. But she was loving it. Whee! She cried as they zipped and zoomed around the room. This is amazing! How are you making us fly, Pop? Puka finally snapped and landed abruptly on the bed. I'm not your pop. I'm a terrifying Puka from the spirit world, here to horrify and unnerve you and leave you shivering and quivering and crying from your mammy. Fia stared at him with a blank expression before bursting into fits of laughter. First of all, Puka pal, I have 2 dads. Second, I am Fearless Fia, and it'll take a lot more than a jump scare and some slime to terrify me. Puka looked very disappointed. He had failed his very first Samhain assignment. Oh, don't be upset, Puka. I may not be easy to scare, but I know 2 people who are. Do you think you can do that same routine again? Puka's face lit up. Oh, you bet I can, he replied. They tiptoed as quietly as they could down the stairs and waited outside the door of the sitting room where Fia's dad and Pop were sitting watching TV, not suspecting a thing. Okay, Puka, on the count of 3, lights out, and then it's your time to shine. 1, 2, 3. Puka snapped his fingers and all the power went out across the house. Pop groaned. Oh, this is typical. My favourite show is about to start. Go take a look at the fuse box, Stephen. Dad was about to argue with him when an eerie green light flooded the room, illuminating the thick fog that covered the ground. Puka floated through the door and let out a horrifying howl, dripping green slime all over the good carpet. Pop and Dad nearly passed out with the fright. They both squealed with the sheer terror and held onto each other tight. Fia could barely stifle her giggles as she watched Puka pick them up and fly around the room through a crack in the door. By the time he was finished his whole routine, poor Dad and Pop were pale white with fright and shaking like leaves. Puka finished off with a final woeful wail and then disappeared again through the door. When Pop and Dad could finally string a sentence together, they cried out for their brave, fearless Fia to come and save them from the awful ghoul who had invaded their home. She sauntered casually into the sitting room. What's wrong with you two? You look as if you've seen a ghost. After they'd calmed down and gone to bed, Fia called Puka out of hiding and they high-fived and feasted on Fia's Halloween sweets in celebration. Puka was having so much fun that he forgot to keep an eye on the time. Miss Morrigan's words of warning started ringing in his ears. All of a sudden, he got into an awful fluster. What time is it, Fia? He cried. Just after midnight. Why? She replied. Puka's face dropped. Oh no, the portal to the spirit world is closed now. I'll never get back. What'll I do? Where will I live? Fia put her arms around Puka and gave him a massive hug. Not to worry, she said. As long as we keep you hidden from Dad and Pop, you can stay here with me. You can teach me all your spookiest tricks and we can go do scary things like watch horror movies and go to haunted houses and be the spookiest pair in all of Ireland. Puka breathed a sigh of relief that he wouldn't have to live on his own in the human world. But he couldn't help but think of his mum and dad back home and how worried they must be. And worried they were. They waited at the portal long after the other ghouls and goblins had returned, but there was no sign of Puka. Miss Morrigan was stumped. Never in my 250 years of teaching has a young ghost been so late returning. He's really cutting it fine now. Midnight was fast approaching. Dad rolled up his sleeves, ready to jump through and find him. Not so fast, cried Miss Morrigan. If you go through now, the pair of you will be stuck and that'll be double the trouble. Mam was getting very upset. But you said it yourself. If he doesn't come back on time, he'll be stuck in the human world forever. Miss Morrigan laughed. Oh, don't be daft. That's just something we tell you all as little ghosties to make sure everyone comes home in a timely manner. It usually works, but your little lad is the exception to the rule here. Mam and Dad breathed a sigh of relief. So we can get him back home, Dad asked. Well, we'll have to do a powerful summoning spell to get Puka back home, and it must be done under a full moon. So he'll be home to you in exactly 1 week's time, replied Miss Morrigan. For the next week, Mam and Dad and Miss Morrigan worked tirelessly to gather the ingredients for the summoning spell. Meanwhile, Puka was settling into his new life in the human realm, not realising his parents were doing everything in their power to get him back home. They had an amazing time together. Fia was so glad to finally have a friend who loves all things spooky as much as she did. They got up to all sorts of scary antics together. They visited the local spooky castle where no kids dared to tread. They went to the cinema to watch a scary movie and went digging for creepy crawlies in the local forest. I'm so glad you let me stay here with you, Fia. I don't know what I would have done without your help, said Puka as he pulled a big slimy worm out of the damp muck. Don't mention it. That's what friends do, Fia replied, adding another slug to her bug menagerie. Above all else, their favourite pastime was frightening the wits out of Fia's neighbour. Every evening, when Dad and Pop were busy watching their favourite reality TV shows, they would sneak out of Fia's bedroom window and fly off around her estate. Puka would use his powers to turn them both invisible, and they would sneakily creep up to the kitchen window of Mr. Cousins, Fia's cranky neighbour. He was forever giving out to all the kids in the estate for playing on the green in case they stepped on his precious daffodils. They would knock on the window gently, making Mr. Cousins very confused when he looked out to see that there was no one there. This would go on until he got very annoyed indeed, assuming it was the local kids playing pranks on him. Then they would knock one more time, and when he came to the window, Puka would reappear looking as gruesome and as grotesque as possible and give Mr. Cousins the fright of his life. Fia and Puka would then slip away into the night and then fall around laughing at how silly Mr. Cousins looked as he shrieked and jumped out of his skin. Together, they really had the best week ever. Until Sunday evening, when Fia broke the news that she had to go back to school in the morning. Well, can't I come with you? Pleaded Puka. I don't know, she replied hesitantly. I know all the good hiding spots around the house, but it'd be harder to keep you a secret in school. When she went off the next morning, Puka tried to keep himself busy, but it was boring all by himself. Soon, he started to feel very lonely and homesick. He wished as hard as he could that his mum and dad would come and find him and bring him back to the spirit world. Luckily for Puka, the full moon was fast approaching. Miss Morrigan gathered all the ghosts and ghouls and monsters so that they could combine their powers to temporarily reopen the portal so that they could slip through and quickly rescue Puka. They formed a big ritualistic circle around a bubbling cauldron, and Miss Morrigan muttered incantations under her breath. Soon the sky began to turn a deep shade of purple, and the stars seemed to burst like fireworks, and everyone used all their power to try and summon the portal. Just then, the air turned into static electricity, and the sparkling, swirling portal appeared before them. "Quickly now," bellowed Miss Morrigan. "Hop in and retrieve young Puka. Our magic is powerful, but we don't know how long it'll hold out for." Mum and Dad took a deep breath, held hands, and jumped through the portal. They shot through the atmosphere at the speed of light, twisting and turning before landing with a thump on a patch of grass in Fia's estate. They both took to the air to get an eagle-eye view of the housing estate. "Oh, how will we know where he is?" they fretted, frantically searching each window, seeing nothing but human children sleeping. Then, shining like a beacon through the night, was a familiar green glow. "That's him! That's our boy!" cried Dad as they made a beeline in the direction of Fia's house. They flew up to Fia's bedroom window where she and Puka were fast asleep. They flew through the window and hovered over the bed. Puka, love, it's Mum and Dad," they said, nudging him awake. When he opened his eyes, he couldn't believe what he saw. I wished for you, and now you're here." "I'm so sorry, Mum and Dad, I lost track of the time and I couldn't get home, and then Fia said I could live with her forever, but I missed you both and everyone at home so much," and he started to cry. Dad wrapped him up in a big hug. "Don't worry, son, we're here to take you home." All the commotion finally woke Fia, who couldn't believe she was seeing not one, not two, but 3 Pukas crowding her bedroom. "It's time we go, son," said Mum, as she took Puka's hand. "Wait, I have to say goodbye first," said Puka, as he rushed to Fia to give her a big hug. "Where are you going?" asked Fia. "My Mum and Dad came to find me. I've loved staying here with you for a holiday, but I miss everyone at home. I got so lonely today when you went off to school," replied Puka with a tear in his eye. Fia started to cry too. "I'll miss you very much, Puka. I've never had a friend who likes scary stuff as much as I do, but I know I'd miss my mum and my dad and my friends at school if I had to leave them behind. But will you come back and visit?" Puka's mum piped up. "Of course he will. Every Samhain he can come back and he can spend the day playing together. We can't thank you enough for looking after our Puka, Fia. Now we really must fly before the portal closes again." The 3 of them flew off through the night as Fia watched on in wonder. They made it back just in time to slip through the portal and arrived home safely to the spirit world. From then on, every year Fia and Puka would count the days until Samhain when they could see each other again and terrorise the local kids. So, if you happen to spy a certain ghost and his human pal this Samhain, make sure you remind them to keep an eye on the time.